that I think this is a problem. So when we think about the example I gave at the beginning, the chronically depressed person who's constantly describing his experiences in clinical language, who has this history of abusive relationships, what would you start brainstorming as ones or twos might be that you would want to hypothesize or to watch for?
Mentioning that he's depressed, you said that they see everyone.
Yeah, frequently self-labeling as a depressed person. Telling you about or describing anecdotes where he's doing this outside of session with work colleagues, with friends, acquaintances. How would you respond to it as a CRB? How would you imagine blocking that behavior if this were your client?
Just I'm noticing, this is what you start by saying, I'm noticing that your kind of language you're using, etc.
That may work. We'd want to track, does pointing out when it's happening decrease it? Or, because the slippery place is that because this is someone that's constantly asserting it, there's also always a risk it could be reinforcing. Yeah. Yes, you've noticed.
Yeah.
You're noticing finally, everything's so depressed.
Like I said earlier, in certain labeling in clinical terms, into breaking down into the sensations, what they actually recognise that. So how do they feel, where do you feel in the body, you can describe that, how did it pass, what triggered it, you know, so you're building up that awareness in situations that happen without actually attributing or learning, which you generalise into one opposite.
Definitely. Even in intake with clients, I always find it helpful. I always find it helpful generally just when a client mentions they're coming for anxiety, they're coming for depression, or these terms cover an umbrella of symptoms. Could you tell me your experience? But anything that blocks that, yeah. Sorry, I don't have previews up, so I don't know what all I put here. But what would you imagine a CRB2 would be? What would you want this client to come in and do differently?
Intrigued if they could track other people's reactions to their responses.
That would be a really sophisticated CRB2, yeah, that he notices. This is how people respond when they do that.
I'd be curious to know if not defining themselves that way just evokes a different response in them. Like, how do you feel when you refer to yourself as a depressed person versus talking about your experience but not calling yourself that? Is it what worse?
Maybe. It starts to get really heady though. Like now we're starting to get into the cognitive content. That would be my word. How would you pare that down so you stay with just the relationship right here? I'm pushing a little because part of the emphasis of FAP is we're always trying to use the relationship here, not questions that, or at least not initially questions that bring it to relationships outside of the room.
Would you just talk about your interaction within, their impact on you and your impact on them?
Yeah, you could ask their impact on you, but also what's happening. Probably do them running over. Oh, okay. And yeah.
This is where I get a little bit muddy, and I don't want to muddy your water too much.
No, muddy.
When you reference act and fact
yeah,
cousins of each other, so I'm trying to marry the two together.
Yeah.
And I often find myself falling into like using act to recognise their behaviour. It's like using the matrix, for example, still. So when I get confused with CRB2s, I always interpret it as being akin to towards you. And until they actually demonstrate or signify what the towards movement look like, I get a bit confused. I have an idea of what I think would be useful, but actually seeing them both or bring out themselves gets hard. So CRB2s, I feel okay finding those, but in terms of I usually interpret it being the exact opposite, so that would be the useful behaviour. So, but whether or not they actually manifest it is another one, and I struggle sometimes to have them organically generated as opposed to me suggesting something. Because I don't want to be too didactic in my approach, but at the same time, that's where I struggle.
Yeah, there is, and this might be something that's gone over tomorrow. There's a trainer, Benji Schundorf, who's done a lot of work on, and has some online videos where he emphasizes using the matrix, but making it FAP. So you might call it a towards move. For those of you who don't use the matrix, we'll cover it later.
Sorry.
But for using the matrix in a FAP context, it would be the top left quadrant where it'd be I'm labeling all my behaviors as depressed, or I'm pointing out frequently I'm depressed. On the one hand, just like in compassion work, when you integrate FAP into this, we're kind of putting an a priori value in the bottom right of it, of saying you want to be connected, you want to have authentic and meaningful relationships. And so then what would that look like here? Like, what are you conveying? Are you, you could ask, when you describe your depressive symptoms, how did you feel when I responded this way? Is this the response you want? Getting to, this is that shared ACT theme of workability, of pragmatism. Is this what you want it to look like? What are you wanting it to look like? Can I invite you to tell it to me a different way? We can see how it feels. And so those are the ways it would look when you, because it's really kind of ACT, just really, really zoomed in on what you're doing together.
I'm getting confused. I feel like I'm getting confused with this. But so for the CRB2s, that is the diffusion work, correct? You're diffusing the client away from this being fused with I am depressed, that is who I am.
So I also teach like a year-long basic like learning theory course. So I'm like, how specific? Yeah, it's subtle. Yes. So the short answer is yes. Like on the one hand, getting them away from that is diffusing. But the point of it is not, in a FAP frame, is not just diffusion or getting them to take, that thought less literally. The point of it functionally between us is, can you feel, like the client feel, that it feels different how you respond when they don't use that language? Can the client notice that they feel different, or they feel more connected when with other people in their life, when they talk differently? And so in the grand scheme of things, that attention to labeling their internal states and noticing the felt sensation of closeness is going to reinforce diffusion. And it's going to weaken that verbal behavior. But they're sort of like overlapping.
So is it basically the CRB2 is like you putting the client's value in the here now during the session?
Yeah, it's all just what's happening right now. Any other CRB2s you want to see with this client?
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned earlier where you're not sure whether a behavior is CRB1 or CRB2. To be able to discern that, what are the types of questions you might ask?
So, there are sort of two answers for this, because the first place I'd go would not be to ask, but to, it does require a lot of trust in yourself and your innate humanness. Did I feel put off by this person in this moment? Can I trust that this might be something other people feel? And maybe it's more specific. Maybe not all other people, maybe other women, maybe other men, maybe there are other ways that you're socially different, that the client's not aware of their impact. What are all the ways that you're willing to invite in of treating yourself as the compass of how you're going to respond? So I would start there. It can be very evocative for a client. Remember, rule 2 is evoking CRBs. So if you're watching for them, the next step is to evoke. So if you're not sure if it's a 1 or a 2, you could say, when you just said that to me, this is what happened in my body. This is, you know, my heart clenched, my stomach fell. It felt very cold between us. What happened for you? So that could be a way to evoke. You know, if the client is caught off guard by that, that tells you a very different story than if the client says, yeah, I also felt very distant, but I don't know why. Or I always feel confused when this happens. Or, you know, it could go a lot of different ways. In terms of questions, then often, you know, I'm sort of like a card, you know, the hand face up on the table kind of therapist. So the idea might be, as you've gone through this, or as you describe this thing, that maybe it's a behavior that doesn't kind of correspond well to what you're doing in therapy. I could share, I'm not sure if this is something that's working for you or not. Would you be willing to do some experiments with me? One of the core homeworks that we often give in FAP is a risk log. This is also something that trainees are typically invited to do, that I have a slide for the end of day homework, so you have a preview to encourage you to consider a risk to try this evening, but to consider an interpersonal risk. And by risk, we mean something that feels emotionally risky. What would feel slightly beyond your comfort zone to do in a relationship right now? If 10 is, I'm going to be flooded with shame no matter how it goes, and that's overwhelming, and a 1 is maybe a hair past how I'm already behaving in my daily life, then what would a 2 or a 3 be that you could be willing to explore and try and do each day this coming week? So I might assign something like that to a client so that we could explore how these go, what the response to those behaviors is. So, so homework could be a part of it. Yeah. Let me see, where do I go? And so naturally reinforcing. So the client does do it too. He describes his experience without talking about symptom language. He feels authentic, meaningful, you're moved. How do you express this to the client? What's most natural for you? Some of us are some of us emit a lot of nonverbals that our clients, you probably know if you do because your clients have commented on. Notice this. Oh, here's an embarrassing, maybe it's a FAP failure story. So there's a principle, okay, I'll tell this story and we'll stop for a break. There's a principle in behavioral training of I think it's the LSR, like least significant response. So the idea is, if you're not going to punish a behavior, but you want to be sure not to reinforce it, you just breathe for a second, you don't respond. And then you attempt to evoke again. You attempt to evoke something. And I had a client I was seeing, had a pretty high-power professional job, but had recently taken on a new duty where they had to go before a judge in closed chambers every couple weeks for hearings related to clients being detained. And this person had a very long habit of, when he was nervous, he would sort of burst out in this really high-pitched kind of forced laugh. and he was doing this in court. And the judge had started to threaten to bar him from the court, which would have severely limited his progression in his career, or to impose steeper penalties. And so in session, you know, what I would try to do is I try to not react. You know, you also don't want to laugh along. It would often come up at very painful moments for the client or disclosing very shameful experiences. So I'd wait a second, and then I'd ask, you know, what were you know, and we both knew sort of the function of the behavior, so the idea of like, let's go back to what you were feeling, you were trying to block. What was the feeling before the laugh? You know, was it shame? Was it sadness? And then we'd go into that. So symptoms improved, therapy was going well, we terminated. A few years later, I got an email, and he said, I wanted to thank you again. I wanted to let you know that whenever I'm tempted to laugh, I remembered that I remembered that look on your face where you'd kind of glance down, maybe look a little let down. And that's what I hold on to. So we are always shaping our clients, whether we know it or not. So let's take a little break now. Watching for CRB 1s and 2s. So, and when we think about the function of someone who describes their behavior really clinically, you know, the function is probably to not feel too vulnerable, right? The function is, many of our clients, you've probably noticed, can find ways to talk a lot about aversive feelings without actually having to feel the aversive feeling, right? It's the talk becomes the buffer. So if you conceptualize it in that way, the 2 would be any sign that you're seeing greater vulnerability, that you're seeing greater affect, that you're seeing. So these are things you might watch for. Up through lunch, we're sort of doing this, working through the rules to kind of dive a little deeper and end with an evocative activity. So in terms of evoking CRB2s, first of all, the treatment content is naturally going to be evocative. You know, asking a client, why are you here, is evocative. So for some clients, that's enough. You could find examples in the FAP literature, though, of in CRBT literature, or CBT literature, of anything from free association to agenda setting to discussing dreams to personal disclosure. All of this could be evocative. There are 2 philosophies, and I think I have this on a later slide, but I'll skip it when I get there. There are 2 philosophies in terms of the techniques we use and that we can borrow from other therapeutic approaches that Bill O'Donoghue in the CBT world has described. The first is theoretical eclecticism, which is when you attempt as best you can to kind of mash together the theory. And there are some elegant examples of this. Paul Wachtel, who wrote a book, Behaviorism and Psychoanalysis, in the 70s, had a big influence on FAP. But the other is just to consider, if anything is fair game, if you're just trying to evoke and just trying to find opportunities to warmly reinforce, it doesn't really matter, well, so long as it's ethical, what you do in those boundaries. Our clients will often come in and say they have a dream that's been hanging in their mind all day or something like that. That all becomes evocative content. I often think of a classic paper, I think it was Cordova and Scott, on an attempt to come up with a functional analysis of what intimacy is, what actually makes something intimate. And they highlighted a few different features. They said, well, it has to be low base rate, right? If it's something that we experience with absolutely everyone in our lives, it's not intimate. So it has to be infrequent. There has to be a possibility for punishment. There's some reason in our learning history, some experience that teaches us that it's at least possible, if we disclose this, that we'll experience punishment. And then, what makes it most intimate is when it's received with warmth, where you take low base rate, high likelihood of punishment, and warm reinforcement. That's sort of the recipe for intimacy. So, disclosing a dream, that involves engaging in incredibly taboo or unethical behavior that you receive warmly and maybe even offer a more connecting theme to. That will fit that model of intimacy. So we're always trying to come back to this idea of the role of goal. The goal of role 2 is to really find any way to prompt a CRB, but particularly a CRB2. You know, we would like to have opportunities to reinforce, and if we're not evocative enough, if our client for some reason just finds our style of engagement not enough to engage, to come up with anything meaningful, then we're not going to be able to do the work.
So,
Oh, yeah.
it almost sounds like going to confessional, but with like unconditional positive regard, in that what they're saying, you want them to say this shameful thing, you want them to say this thing that you wouldn't normally say because you anticipate a negative outcome, and then you give them the opposite, you give them that reinforcement. So am I thinking it correctly, or am I thinking it wrong?
Mostly, I would just add the caveat that, like, certainly we follow our ethical guidelines. There's, you would still report child abuse to the appropriate authorities. You would still, but the majority of our clients, what they feel shame around is not something that's a criminal act or something we might be concerned with. It's you know, something they did in childhood, something that was done to them in childhood, something that a desire or fantasy or a wish that feels inappropriate, that may or may not be in the general, you know, the consensus of the general public. So these are the sorts of things that so many of our clients come to us with. For those, this was, I think, before, just before you arrived, but with the opening Mohini exercise, many of you, it sounded like shared things that you don't typically talk with colleagues about, but it didn't sound like anyone heard anything that you would think of as criminal, as unethical, as worrisome. Low base rate is low base rate. There's a guy, Arthur Aaron, who does a lot of closeness research. If any of you saw the headlines a few years back of like the 36 questions to fall in love, this was based on his research, which is grounded in the same principle. And he escalates the intimacy primarily through manipulating the likelihood of rejection. So he prioritizes. It could be interesting if you ever like look up that list just to see what's in there, because in the first block, where it's supposed to be sort of the least intimate, but building it, low base rates cranked high, possibility of warm response is cranked high, but then likelihood of rejection is what varies. So the first tier of this 3 sets of questions involves questions like, what did you want to be when you grew up when you were 5? You could probably think of something, but how many of you have been asked that lately? Does your spouse know the answer to that question? Do your kids? So the infrequency being so high actually makes that a somewhat intimate discussion topic. Although, of course, the intimacy becomes deeper and more meaningful as the likelihood of rejection grows. I feel like I went on a tangent and I forget if I answered your question now. All right. Great. So conversational prompts. What would be most difficult to discuss with me today? What are you most afraid to talk about? What's the most embarrassing or shameful thing that happened to you this week? All of these are things that at times I've had clients where we start each session. What was most shameful this week? What was most scary? What was most difficult? And go from there. So these are all things that are highly likely to evoke that response. And think again of that sort of 3 recipe mix, or 3 ingredient recipe of low base rate, high perceived risk of rejection or history of rejection, high likelihood of